The biggest story in fantasy football right now isn't any one player. It wasn't Chase Claypool's breakout. It wasn't the disappointment of Kenyon Drake or Joe Mixon. It wasn't even the Dak Prescott injury this week. The biggest story in fantasy football right now is the COVID shuffle that the coronavirus is putting on this league right now.
Sounds like an awful dance.
It's terrible. I mean, the Cupid shuffle's bad enough, but the COVID shuffle
It's actually just a Cupid shuffle with a mask.
It's the Cupid shuffle in 2020.
Yeah, 6 feet apart.
Man, weddings in 2021 are gonna suck. Oh man.
So we've come across these new issues as fantasy owners that we have never had to deal with before. It started in week 4 when Tennessee and Pittsburgh got postponed, moved to week 7. Baltimore, Pittsburgh got moved to week 8. Everyone had to shuffle around the players that they had rostered from the Steelers and Titans. If you're a Derrick Henry owner, you know the pain. If you have any Steeler, you know the pain. The Patriots were also affected in week 4. They had Cam Newton test positive. Kansas City and New England was still able to play that week, but they got moved from Sunday to Monday night. In week 5, more positive Tennessee testing. And hopefully, as of this podcast, Buffalo and Tennessee is still on. So hopefully by the time you're listening to this, Tennessee hasn't had any further positive. That moved the Buffalo and Kansas City game to week 6 from Thursday night. We also had a positive Jets test this week in week 5, but it turned out negative. No, fantasy owners were really sweating that one because it's the Jets.
I feel like just with all these tests, I'm so nervous for, just anything. You know what I'm saying? And I think the biggest fear of mine is I can get through the postponements. It's frustrating. I think all owners right now are. I can't be the only one that's ready to pull all their hair out. But I think the scariest potential outcome here is that they change the format mid-season here. And if too many teams start coming up with these issues, I'm afraid we're going to be looking at some changes that affect not only us as fans of our teams, but our fantasy teams and the potential for football to continue as close to normal as it can. So that's what I'm worried about. I'm not saying they're going to cancel the season, but I can definitely see an alternative being proposed. Like, okay, well, maybe we'll just, for the last, for the second half of the season, we'll just say it's division play only or something, if it gets too bad. And I would hate that in a year that the Browns are doing so well.
Wouldn't that be the most Cleveland thing ever?
Oh, man, it would be. You know it. We were just talking about, talking the talk, but it is something to think about. Hypothetically, let's say that those turds at ESPN were right, and the Browns do have a shot at making it to the Super Bowl. Could you imagine?
An empty stadium at the Super Bowl?
Oh, my God. It's a fear. It's a legit fear. But now I'm sitting here, but for any team, I'm sitting here, of course, hoping that the Browns are in that position. But for any team, if your team makes it, can you imagine being like, yeah, no, I can't, I'm just going to watch it on TV and high five my sleeping uncle or something.
Well, we just saw the Lakers win it with no fans present.
And it felt
that whole finals felt so weird without the fans, man. It really did.
There was no juice. There was no electricity.
It's so much different. It really is. Off. But I think at this point it's safe to say that COVID has supplanted Corey Coleman as my least favorite 19 at this point. But and hindsight is 2020 now, because now, like, the way I look at it now, it kind of boggles my mind that the NFL, with all the time they had to prepare, they didn't put in like extra bye weeks during the regular season to kind of prevent these types of things, shuffling around the schedule and things like that. Obviously, like I said, hindsight's 2020, but if they put 3 or 4 bye weeks in, it was just open weeks where you could put games that had
floaters.
Yeah,
just a rescheduling week.
Simple stuff like that. It's nuts to me that the NFL didn't do something like that.
And of course, we're saying this because we've watched what happens now.
Yeah, hindsight's 2020.
Hindsight, but it is something that, like, you'd think these dudes that are making quadrillions or whatever the hell the NFL makes, pool together a few of their smart guys and say, oh, yeah, we should probably be prepared just in case. But we're here now, and Christian, you're gonna have to walk me through a couple things I can do to manage through this.
Obviously, we just saw in week 5 the New England and Denver game got postponed. We had to take all of those players out of our lineups. The Chargers and Broncos game got moved to week 8. Miami and Denver moved to week 11. Kansas City and Buffalo got moved to Monday Night Football of next week. Shuffling all across the board. So now as a fantasy owner, what I'm noticing that I'm doing, I'm taking all of the players and playing them in a non-flex position as early as I can, which you should already be doing for the Thursday night game. That's a staple rule across the board, because in case you get screwed by a last-minute inactive on Sunday morning or an injury at 12:45 before kickoff, instead of be limited to sub a running back with a running back in a running back spot, you can sub in any flex position for that same running back later on. Now, what I'm noticing is that on any team that has questions, so for this week, for Tennessee and Buffalo owners, if you own any of their fantasy assets going into this week, it would have been your best option and your best bet to put those players in your flex. Move Derrick Henry from running back to flex, and then if news breaks on Monday saying Tennessee had a positive test, game is off on Tuesday, you're able to sub in a Monday Night Football player. As we're recording this podcast, would be a Charger or a Saint. So for the whole rest of the season, what I think we have to do is any time that we have players that are questionable, their entire team is considered questionable, I think that we should be moving all of those players into our flex positions and having a Monday night player rostered whenever available. Let's say that you're down by 4 going into the Monday night game. You have a choice between a Tuesday night player like Devin Singletary or a Monday night player, say Emmanuel Sanders. But you're down by 4. That's something that Sanders can attain by himself. Play Sanders because he's the sure play. His team's going to take the field. Play Sanders and hope he can get those 4 points for you instead of leaning on a player that you don't know is going to play. If Schefter gets on the Twitter machine and says Tennessee had a positive test, and this goes for every week from here on out, I'm just using Tennessee and Buffalo because it's the current situation right now. We're going to have more throughout the season. We've seen New England test positive. We saw the Jets have a false positive. We've seen Tennessee get wrecked by this virus. They're not going to be the last ones. So if anyone tests positive from here on out and the NFL reschedules their game for a Monday night or a Tuesday night, any player that you own from that roster should immediately go to your flex if you want to play them at all. Now, if you have a start-sit question that is a toss-up, if there's 2 even players with decent matchups and you just don't know which one to play, just go with the one that you know is going to take the field.
Yeah, I think that's the rules I've been loosely going by as we're learning through this. And that's still, on top of injuries, that's still such a tough call to make.
I mean, I like to think that that's basic fantasy manager knowledge, though. It seems like a lot of people, because I see a lot of people complaining in like league message boards and Facebook groups and group chats, like, "Oh man, this is total bullshit. I have so many guys on the COVID, and so many injured guys and bye weeks." And it's like, we all entered this season knowing what the risks were.
We knew what we were signing up for.
So I don't really like hearing the complaining. Like, yeah, I totally get it. I totally get the frustration, and it's totally justified to be frustrated at all this. But to think that, we have to alter league rules, and yeah, changes are going to have to be made. We went through it last week when we decided how we were going to, approach the game that got postponed last week in the event that gets canceled. But don't include me in the complaining, some of this complaining, because we all knew what we were getting into.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's still a gamble. It's what it is, so some of these guys that are disputing with commissioners, I see it in a few of my leagues where it's something has to be done. It's like we're all going through it. And every team, like I'm a Derrick Henry owner, and all I can think about is how actually frustrated I am that now I'm going to go 2 weeks of not being able to, or potentially going 2 weeks without having him in my lineup. He's the most important part of my lineup, but at the same time, the NFL's not going to be like, well, they're just not going to play the game, and we'll just count it as a forfeit. That's not going to happen. So it's going to make its way back around, and it's going to work out. All the people that are crying about like commissioners need to make a rule change, so on and so forth. To me, it's just like, just wait for it to swing back around the other side.
With what you've just mentioned about commissioners and having, quote unquote rule changes, how do you guys feel? And I've, as a commissioner in a few of my leagues, I made this option available with all of the COVID uncertainty. And it's not fair to fantasy owners that we're not sure if a game on a Tuesday is going to be played. Obviously, if there's an injury that you've been monitoring all week and they don't play on Sunday, you're going to know at kickoff and you'll be able to swap someone out. If an entire game is canceled on a Tuesday after every other game has been played, that's not fair to fantasy owners as a whole. So what I did and what I've seen a lot of leagues doing, and I've seen a couple commissioners even copy what I've done here in my leagues after I posted the messages. If there's a Tuesday game with so much uncertainty like we see with Buffalo and Tennessee in week 5, I gave my entire league an option to nominate a backup player. Let's say I'm a Derrick Henry owner and I have 5 running backs on my roster. What I would be able to do by rule in this league is post in the league chat and say, I nominate X running back as Derrick Henry's backup. You have to nominate it before that backup start time, and you're locked into that backup. If that backup outscores Derrick Henry and Derrick Henry plays, you still get Derrick Henry's points. But if that game were to be canceled, as a commissioner, I have the ability to go into that matchup and manually edit your roster for that week. How do you guys feel about a nomination rule for these COVID games?
So it's funny you say that, because we talked a little bit last week off the air about how when you sent that to our league, as this is how we're going to move forward with this, I sent it to my other leagues that were struggling, looking for an answer for people. Every league I'm in is now using that, and it's the best way to do it, because yeah, it is unfortunate, especially like for a deep league. These are the guys that are going to get it the most, because if you can't play Derrick Henry, and I'm in a situation, I'm ironically playing, you would think that our only friends are each other, because this week I'm playing Paul in 2 leagues. And in one of those situations, I had Melvin Gordon. He's getting postponed. There's nobody on my bench that can score the points that he could have potentially put up. It's just not there.
Now, as a side note, before you go any further with that point, if a game is postponed early to the point where, just like they did with Denver and New England, how they announced beforehand with well enough time, this game is canceled for week 5. It's on the fantasy manager to take those players out of the lineup. I'm not going to give any backup options for those players, because that automatically I consider their bye. It's only for games that are technically still on, delayed after all the rest of them. Let's say it's on a Monday night or a Tuesday night. That's when I will allow the nomination rule.
Yeah, so, and that's where I was going. So basically in that league, I had to go pick somebody up because of a postponement. Now, obviously I'm not going to get those points that Melvin Gordon would have put up. But then you get these other leagues where, you're using the backup, where it's like, okay, the game's in question. When you're using a backup, that's when it's tough, because like the scenario you threw out there already, where if your starting guy, let's just use Derrick Henry, if he has a bad game and the guy you put as his backup has a great one, then you just feel like an asshole. Because
then you just should have played that guy from the start.
Exactly.
But it still allows managers to make a decision, and you're not going to get the best of whichever player. You're going to get the player that you nominated only if that player does not play on Tuesday night.
No, that's definitely my favorite of the ones that I've seen, and I've seen some wacky ones being thrown out there. Like if your player is in a game that gets postponed, what if we take the average of that position and apply?
That's terrible.
Stuff.
What?
Yeah, stuff like that. I'm telling you, man, I've seen some wacky ones. So once Christian came out with his idea, I got to be honest, I thought it was my favorite. So it's simple to me. Now what? Because I had somebody in my league bring this up. What about the regularly scheduled Monday night game? Do you apply that same rule to that? Because I said no initially.
No, absolutely not.
Because there was no, there's no reason to believe that was in jeopardy at that point. So I was like, because when I brought up your rule into my league, I adopted that. Thankfully, it wasn't trademarked, so I don't owe you anything on it. But I had a guy come back at me saying, "Hey, well, what about the regularly scheduled Monday night game?" And I said, "I mean, there's no reason to believe that that's in danger at this point, so it doesn't apply to that."
Yeah, if there's no knowledge of it being postponed beforehand, there's no reason to sub a player out for it. You can't just say, "Oh, this game's on Monday night. If so-and-so's injured, do I get a sub?" Absolutely not. That's part of the game. You should be managing to a point where you know whether or not you're going to play someone in their place. When we're talking about 2 entire rosters being out of commission as the last games of the day, I'm going to take the members of my league, I'll take them out from behind the 8 ball, and I will give them a backup option that I can manually edit as commissioner. Now, I'm going to shout out Sleeper again as being ahead of the curve with fantasy football and allowing COVID cancellations to go onto their IR spots. With doing that, it allows players to, backup options that they can nominate to play in place of their stars. But when we're talking about ESPN, we're talking about Yahoo, that's a situation where every week before the Thursday night game, you are going to want to go onto your free agent wire and pick someone up that's playing on that Monday night game, because you just don't know if we're going to have any COVID questions between Thursday and kickoff on Sunday on any given week. You're going to want to have someone that can play in your flex that is playing on Monday night, even if it's the third string receiver on one of the teams that's playing. It's better than not having anyone after all of those Sunday games have played out.
1 point is always better than 0.